Well, thank you for having me here today. I want to talk a little bit about the American Disabilities Act and how it applies to technology, why you might want to care, and problems with complying, and maybe some ideas about how to comply. I am not, this is an area that's fairly new to me. I've done a little bit of research. I've done a lot of research, but I haven't done a lot of practicing in this. I have some people who I know who practice in this area, and if you have any tough questions, I'm probably going to refer you to them. But I did want to give an overview of what's going on in this space. A lot of times people, when they think of the American Disabilities Act, they really think of building code. They think of having, having a ramp in front of a building and those kinds of things, physical accessibility, which is a lot of what some of the pieces cover. But as more and more everyday people interact with organizations based on technology, it becomes applicable in that space. So some of the places that it's applicable is websites. So if you're interacting, and sometimes is and sometimes isn't, we'll talk about that later, but if you're interacting with people as a business through a website, or as a government through a website, those have requirements to be accessible across disabilities. Videos, people are using more and more videos on their websites, and they have certain specific requirements. Streaming, any kind of streaming content. Video meetings. With the pandemic, we've all gone to Zoom and Team and Microsoft Chat and all of those kinds of things, and they have some concerns specifically. Mobile apps. If you're interacting with people on mobile apps, thinking about what are the disability issues in the mobile apps. Self-checkout. How many people have said, you go to the store and you get to pay the stores for yourself to do the work, to check yourself out. So, but more and more that is the truth, and the capability is there to check out, and the ability to use those machines, it matters. And then last, any kind of self-service portal. And that includes, I don't know, but I've been going to a lot of service providers, doctors, dentists, lawyers, others, that when I get there, they hand me a computer. They don't say, hi, we want to talk to you. They don't do anything else, but they hand me a computer and tell me that I need to sign in through the computer. And as soon as you do that, that technology becomes, a front gateway to access to your services. So why do I care? ADA-related digital lawsuits rose 23% in 2020, which is almost 10 lawsuits every business day. That is, most of those are in retail. Some are in food service, other education, entertainment, and leisure. So mostly it's when you're interacting with the public. But if you have that kind of position, that's key. But as I've said, we're all accepting more and more of this technology into how we do business. I will say one of the things, and I'll talk about this a little later, is over 20% of the lawsuits in 2020 were filed against an organization that had already been sued at least once in the past 2 years. So one of the things that is happening is people are finding easy targets. And I hate to say that they're frivolous, but they are lawyer recommended suits. They are suits that are not coming necessarily from a disabled person who's really having difficulty getting access, but a lawyer saying, oh, look, I can find all the websites that don't meet these requirements, because there are requirements and are penalties that they can then settle under those penalties and still make some money. If you look at the chart, this was mid-2021, and as of June, and you can see that the lawsuits have been rising over time. And a lot of that, although there is the small problem of the lawyers perpetuating lawsuits on their own, a lot of that shows how much we are reliant on technology in our everyday, interaction with businesses and with retail, with restaurants. Think about until last year, I'd go into a restaurant, I'd get a paper menu, or until 2 years ago, I'd get a paper menu and I'd order and I'd never see any technology. And now I can't get the menu until I get the until I get the QR code, and I have to get it on my line. And there's more online ordering, there's more online everything. And some of that has been to keep from passing things back and forth to be more pandemic safe. But otherwise, it's also just where the technology is going. And you're going to see, you're going to see more and more of this. And so I think this is not going to be, this isn't a fluke. The pandemic has brought the technology on, but once you have it on here, no one's probably going to get rid of it. Top states: New York, California, Florida, Pennsylvania. As I said, there are some firms that are doing this, and they are bringing us forward. And so there are disability lawyers that have this in their sites about what matters and what doesn't, and they see easy targets if you're disobeying these rules. So what are the legal issues? I talk about ADA as the starting point, but it's not the only law that we'll talk about. But ADA has 3 titles that are relevant here, but there's also the rehabilitation, the Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act. There's also equal employment opportunity laws. There's all of these apply. I'll just walk through a little bit. Title I of ADA is really about being fair in employment of personnel. What is an accommodation that allows a person to do a job? So in that place, it's really about getting the job. So it's about the employment process in Title I. And so anything that you use, any technology you use, if you're doing web applications, if you're if you just say, when someone asks for whether you're hiring and you point them to your website, the next step in the process is your website needs to be compliant. So you have to start thinking about what are all those steps. Once they're employed, it really moves to EEOC. So so it's not all ADA at that point. Title II applies to state and local, applies to all non-federal government entities, regardless of size. And Title III is really about public accommodation and commercial facilities. It is focused on physical accessibility, but we'll talk about how people are using that and what they're doing with that. So there are a number of new bills. There are some federal bills to try and make this make sense. Sort of the Online Disability Act and others. None of them have gotten through the system yet, but you are seeing a lot of movement saying people don't know what to do. People are unsure. People, it's unclear what everybody has to do. So you're seeing a lot of law in this space. And that's, of course, that gets us lawyers, we're paying attention to it, and that probably doesn't help on the number of lawsuits. So what is meaningful access principle is really still in question. If people can see all of your website except for one piece of streaming content, is that good? Is that not good? Do they have to have meaningful access to every element? If you have short descriptions that explain what's in the video, is that adequate? There's a lot of questions as to what is sufficient in this space at this time. And then the reason you may not make something accessible is because it requires a fundamental alteration or an undue burden. And those are also, there's a lot of settled law about what that means in the physical space, but there's not a lot of settled law about what that means in cyberspace. And so a lot of these questions are really up in the air right now, and we'll talk a little bit about some of the questions that people are arguing about right now. But even the question of when does it apply? When do you need to be accessible is really a question. And what is the standard? Okay, so I need to apply what's good enough. When am I meeting all the things you need to do? And so part of the problem with this, and part of the reason that lawsuits are coming, is that the guidelines of what to do and when to do it and why to do it, when, how, why, all of those questions aren't really answered for people. But I think in the next while, what you'll see is this area really clarifying. And that means that your requirements are really going to clarify. So if you have a business that interacts with the public in any way, or you're interacting with your employees, or you're interacting with a group of employees, video meetings is a great example of that. You're not perhaps having them all just with your employees, but you may be bringing other people in. We're all on a Zoom call right now. What are your responsibilities to make sure that those avenues are accessible? So just starting with some disabilities. So with some disabilities, with some definitions. This is a very legal area, and exactly what counts as a disability, what doesn't count as a disability, are very are questions under law that have been addressed. So I will say that if you bring in someone who really understands what you need to do, but if you are, especially if you have technology outreach that is for the public, I would say make sure that you're paying attention to this. I wanted to walk through this just a little bit, and this goes over 2 slides, so it's a little long, but it talks about places of public accommodation. And if you read the definition, you'll realize, and it's one of the things that is making people grapple with this, is the place of public accommodation means a facility operated by a private entity whose operations affect commerce and fall within at least one of these categories. So that is talking about physical locations. And so even though a website is not a facility, this definition still plays pretty heavily on whether a website, there's a lot of question right now about if you have a physical location, if you have, I'll pick a store, Old Navy store, and then you have an Old Navy website. That Old Navy website is associated with your facility. And that website might be more of a concern than someone who is online only. And that seems like a weird way to define where the law matters in cyberland, but it does seem to be connected to brick and mortar at this point in time, which is an interesting thing when you see Amazon going from being really online only to having more and more physical locations, that they're actually bringing themselves into this type of requirement. The specifics, as you go through this, it does cover it. You'll see why hospitality, retail, and entertainment are high on the list of places that have been sued lately. But, number 5 is retail. And if you go through, but it does include, if you look at 6, it includes dry cleaners, banks, barbershops, beauty shops, travel service, shoe repair, gas stations, accountants, lawyers, pharmacies. It includes other service establishments. So it's not healthcare providers. So it's not just retail and entertainment, any kind of public transportation. Museum, library, gallery means that even does show that not-for-profit and those kinds of things are still included. Places of parks and zoos, so it doesn't have to be necessarily indoors or a building. A facility doesn't mean that. And certainly schools and others. So just so everybody can sort of understand the types of places that need to be accessible. And then if you think about their online counterparts and how that plays in place. The last of the definitions, and some of these are really fuzzy at this point in law, which is always fun when you're actually trying to prove a case. But meaningful access is the best I could find. There's a lot of discussion about it, but it's when an individual has meaningful access to a benefit, they don't need additional accommodations. So if you can get part of the benefit, but then you need additional accommodations to get all of the benefit, then they'll usually consider that not adequate for meaningful access. If you can access, even though there's, perhaps more difficulty or additional steps you need to take, all of the benefit through the methods that you're given, then it's usually considered meaningful access. Fundamental alteration is if a change that is so significant that it alters the essential goods, services, and facilities. So if you provide mountain biking, I don't know, if you provide really physical activity that it's really hard to provide to someone who doesn't have certain capabilities, then if that would alter what you're offering so much as a fundamental alteration, that is usually sort of a threshold of what you may not need to do. And then undue burden, and that is always, undue is always one of those very subjective things, would cause significant difficulty or expense if carried out. There are certainly years of case law that talk about how much is too much additional expense. Is it, 10% of your income? Is it all the profit of providing that service? What is it? And not a well-defined thing, especially if you're looking at the technology piece of it. A lot of the law and a lot of the discussion on this has been about the fundamental service. And so if you're providing it, if you're providing the primary service, and that primary service is going to cost more than you're charging to do that primary service, then you may be able to argue an undue burden from a cost perspective. But if the outreach or something else that you're not that is an overhead element, how much more would that additional cost have to be an undue burden? And that gets very questionable in the analysis. So I added this, and our website's covered by Title III. And the real question, what really seems to be saying is that standing alone websites aren't covered. But if it has a nexus to a physical place of accommodation, then you need to. And but we are still in question there. There's 2 circuits that have weighed in and 3 circuits that should soon. And then eventually this may go to the Supreme Court if there's big variation in that space. So all of that questions is makes it a little hard to know exactly what to do. And we'll talk a little bit more in this section when we're talking about complying, about what you can do and what's adequate. So these are some really high level goals. There's 508 rules that lay out. Microsoft does a 508 compliance analysis of sites or of pages of documents of things, and it'll tell you what doesn't work. I don't know if you've ever done that, but it's available on, Microsoft 365 as a tool. There are programs that will do that for you. There's a lot of capability in that space. And if you think about it, but there are other things that just make it easier. Drop-down boxes are hard for some. Utilizing resources out there, the National Federation of the Blind does have guidance on what works and what doesn't work for a blind person on technology. It is much easier if you start from scratch than if you try and add it at the very end. If you think about design for disabilities in the beginning, you're not going to create as many things that you have to fix in the end. And there are accessible templates. We'll talk about them a little bit later. There's also overlays, and there's also some other pieces that we'll talk about it. Don't forget about captioning for video and live streaming. I recently realized Teams will do capturing, will do captioning if you turn it on. And don't forget that there are people with disabilities who don't use a keyboard or mouse. They're using voice dictation, they're needing captioning. Those kinds of things are easy ways to fix some basic problems in how you implement this. There are some standards. And so WCAG is a standard that talks about accessibility. The problem that we have is that it is not, the law never says this is adequate. If you do this, you're good. So although it is probably the most used standard for everybody, and what I think you could argue is a reasonable approach to trying to implement this. And so, but there are different levels. So you want to think about how far down this path you are going. There are ADA compliance overlays. So knowing that there's an image on the page isn't helpful if you don't know what the image depicts. So there are things that will go through and analyze your page and help it be ADA compliant, but you really have to think it through. Some pictures are easy to explain, some are difficult, and that the AI and the analysis that they do is not great in some of those cases. So using an overlay is a great place to go and find what they think are issues, but I would make sure that you don't just rely on the overlay solutions for all of that. I did want to, there's a little bit of analysis here on the various video conferencing platforms. And I just wanted to walk through, because I think we're all using those now with the pandemic. So you can turn on, they have good speech recognition, and you can do live transcript on some of the tiers. The various elements of what you turn on matters. So you need to know what version you're using and what you're putting in place. So if you're using a lot of video and you're the host and you're bringing a lot of people in, start thinking this through. And as this points out, it does have some limitations when you do breakout rooms and other pieces. So think about how you structure it. Maybe always keep one group, even though you do breakout rooms, keep one in the main room so you can manage that and let people know. So those are the types of things you might want to do. Google Meets, the ASR access is free, but you have to have the paid version of Google Meets. So, there's some piece there. And so part of the question is, how fast are the transcripts versus that? So all of these, and it says some companies have security concerns with Google Meets, some have it with Zoom, so certainly, and then Microsoft Teams. ASR is available, captioning may or may not work if you and the host, so you have to make sure that you coordinate this. Anyone who's used Teams a lot knows that they're making a lot of changes, especially in the last year, very fast. And so every once in a while, you think you have a feature and the feature goes away. So they are adding more and more features. There are, always concerns with font size and other elements to that make it easier for people to use. And that's really just sort of the overview I wanted to give. Try and find the just so that people can sort of walk through that. But one of the things I want everybody to think about is, what tools am I using that talks to the public, and how are what are the technology concerns with those tools from a disability point of view. Thank you, Kevin. Kevin gave us some ADA toolkit links. Those are always helpful. ADA, that PCA toolkit as a whole is good, and chapter 5 is about websites, but there are other chapters as well. I would go look at that if you think you're doing any of the kind of items that I was talking about. Any other questions?
I did want to point out that Joe Meekum offered another resource, the World Wide Web Consortium.
W3C.
You know, Trish, I was glad to hear that you spoke to drop-downs not being as easy for some people as others. As somebody who spent a lot of time with a broken right arm, you're right. Right being my dominant hand. Some of those things are hard to do.
Yeah, and you don't think about it. People who don't have a disability don't notice all those little things. A little bit of reading can make your site a hugely easier place to be. And it generally, there are sometimes some problems. You know, sometimes you have a great graphic that you think explains the world, and it's very hard to have that, you know, explained in a way that's not through visual means. But in general, it is your responsibility. You're using this as a communications platform. The right reason to do it is not to avoid lawsuits and to do that, but to really talk and to, you know, serve the customers with disabilities. And if you can do that with easy things like not using some drop downs or not to putting, or making sure you explain what a video tells you, you know, those kinds of things, that goes a long way to opening up doors for those clients.
I want to call Adam out. He's a physical therapist by training and licensing and certification. And I know he's dealt with a lot of people who are, let's say, temporarily altered due to accidents or surgeries. Have you ever encountered anyone, Adam, that has challenges with technology? And how would you suggest advising them?
To be completely honest, I've encountered plenty of people that have disabilities, but I had not really thought about it from a digital aspect. So, I mean, this is a great presentation to improve awareness on that side. So thank you, Patricia, for informing us on that. But I mean, there are a lot of ways in which we can start to implement this, and you know, as we increase connectivity, you know. But yeah, I don't know if I had really thought about this prior to the presentation. So,
well, that's good. That's why we do this, to open your brain, right?
Yeah, and if you think about, you know, as cyber becomes more pervasive, as we interact with people more frequently and more substantively over the internet and over technology, it becomes more and more important from an ethical standpoint to make sure that we're meeting all people and reaching out to all people. So a lot more to discuss. This was really just the tip of the iceberg, but I also thought that it's something that I think a lot of people aren't thinking about when they're walking into their technology planning. So,
Teresa, Patricia, if I may, I have a background in serving people with disabilities in a previous life. I think Teresa knows about it. And there are several other good resources wherever you are in the country. Check and see if there's not a Center for Independent Living in the area you are in. Many times they will have tools and technology that they have already checked out. And people on staff, by law, have to be 51% individuals with disabilities. So they are often able to help if you're trying to put a website into a form that will be successful for persons with disabilities. You might also check out the National Council on Independent Living. They're up in the DC metro area. And there's also, if it's still running, there is a symposium that runs every year called the NADA Symposium, the National Americans with Disabilities Act Symposium, and they have a lot of good speakers. And this might be something that you particularly, the folks at PKH might want to get involved with to make presentations to, because you get people from all over the country that probably are not even aware of the issues relating to the cyber side of things for serving people with disabilities. There are also a number of trade shows that may be coming back finally after the pandemic that you might want to consider displaying at. NCIL should have a listing of those and where they meet. And I know from going to them for over 11 years, even in its infancy, there was very little in the cyber or the web world about how to serve people. It was only about tools, not so much about the technology backing.
I appreciate it very much. As I said, this is an area that's a little new to me, but I really felt like the visibility of it mattered, because it isn't something you immediately think about. And, you know, with the pandemic, everybody, you know, it kind of forced some, you know, reality back to everybody. But if you think about it, there's some real advantages to, Teresa and I have been up here in Alaska, and we've been talking about the benefits of Indigenous people of having remote access to work and remote access to education. But if you think about that, that's true of people with disability too. If you don't have to, you know, do the physical move from, you know, where you are to where you are, and you can do remote work, but it has to be accessible. So we can open up for that population as well. So I'm excited about all the opportunity.
You know, and Trish, this has been eye-opening for me, even though I've been kind of swimming in this lane for a while. I know we use tools, Joe, as you like Dragon Naturally Speaking. Mm-hmm. And I know that there is a center in Tulsa, and I'm trying to, it's kind of one of those old lady
resources.
Right? And you can go there and get, like, if you're an amputee and you need to adjust how you use a trackball instead of a mouse, that type of thing. And they can actually fit technology to your particular disability. But it's once you can get on a computer, how do you interface with the information? And it's making me rethink how we do some of our digital training, Trish. I know we're SCORM compliant, but
the right direction, yes. But and ladies, I am more than happy to be a resource and help out. Like I said, I did this for over 11 years, and it is still partly a passion of mine, particularly as I now having moved into IT and working as a business analyst and in other areas as well.
Thanks, Joe. I won't forget that.
Not a problem.
Thank you very much.
Not a problem, Trish.
Anybody else that wants to be picked on or contribute?
Well, thank you very much.
Thanks, Trish, for your time and your insights on this topic. It's certainly got a lot of us thinking differently.